Hey guys, tonight we step into a room where the air is cool and dry and the only light comes from a soft lamp on a desk pooling gold across a spreads of clay tablets like little bricks of moonlight. You can almost smell the dust baked into their pores, that faint mineral scent of old river mud turned into memory. Archaeology suggests that these cuneiform marks really are voices from ancient Mesopotamia, but what they mean can shift depending on how you listen. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Because historians debate translations vary and time has a way of leaving gaps you could fit a whole universe into. And yes, you probably will not survive this story as a neat list of facts, because the past refuses to sit still when you try to pin it down like a butterfly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you are listening from and what your local time is right now, because I love imagining this story drifting across different nights and different rooms. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean closer. Your eyes track the wedge-shaped impressions, each tiny mark pressed by a reed stylus into wet clay, then fired by accident or intention, then buried, then recovered, then carried into modern hands that suddenly feel too warm and too loud. Most historians agree that writing in Mesopotamia begins as practical record keeping, a way to count grain, sheep beer, rations and labour. The evidence we do have points to that kind of everyday administration being one of the first reasons anyone bothered to make language visible. But you also notice how quickly the practical slips into the poetic. A careful reading might suggest that once you can record numbers, you can also record stories. And once you can record stories, you can record the kind of stories that make the night feel larger than your bedroom. And that is where our topic drifts in quiet as breath. A popular rumour claims that Sumerian texts contain hidden accounts of a gigantic war among the Anunnaki, framed like a cosmic civil war, with factions in the heavens and consequences on earth. To be clear, this is debated. Most scholars treat the Anunnaki as a category of deities in Mesopotamian religion, not literal extraterrestrials, with a paperwork problem. That is the solid ground. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, you are allowed to wonder. You are allowed to hold a thought like a warm mug in your hands and ask, what if the story is pointing at something else? You begin by picturing where these tablets came from, not a museum case, but a city waking under the sun. Archaeology suggests that the southern Mesopotamian plain was a place of rivers that changed their minds, of marshes, reeds, mud and blazing sky. Most historians agree that communities here built canals and levees, turning seasonal water into reliable fields which then supported dense city life. You can almost hear it, shovels biting wet earth reeds, cracking the slap of water against a bank, a shouted joke that vanishes into heat haze. It's not glamorous. It is work. It is people doing the long, stubborn task of surviving in a landscape that does not give you anything for free. And yet the city rises. You see low mud brick walls, narrow lanes, courtyards, where goats complain about being goats, and a temple complex that looks like the one place the horizon decided to take shape. What's broadly accepted is that temples were central institutions tied to economy, labour and identity. A more cautious explanation could be that religion and government are not separate categories here, because the same building that hosts ritual also hosts storage rooms and accounting. In this world, a prayer might be a poem, and it might also be a budget meeting, which is frankly relatable. You walk with your imagination into a scribal school. The room is shaded, and you are grateful because the sun outside is performing like it has a contract. A teacher sits with the calm authority of someone who has corrected the same mistake 10,000 times. You are given a lump of clay. It is cool and heavy in your palm, and for a moment you understand why people kept making tablets. Clay is forgiving. Clay waits. Clay does not flinch when you mess up. Your stylus presses in and you leave a mark that is not pretty, but it is real. The teacher makes a sound that could mean disappointment or could mean keep going. In a perfect universe, it means you are trying and that counts. But we are not here to prove anything. Tonight we are following clues. Most historians agree that scribes were trained through copying lists and repetition, and that literacy was specialized. Historians still argue whether the average city resident could recognize any signs at all, or whether writing stayed mostly in elite hands. You can imagine the debate in modern terms. Were these words public, or were they private, tucked behind temple walls like secrets with a salary? Either way, writing becomes power, because if you can record what is owed, you can also record who is owed. And if you can record who is owed, you can decide who matters. Now here comes the interesting slide. On some tablets, you find gods, not as abstract ideas, but as named figures with tempers, duties, and social circles. The evidence we do have points to a rich pantheon where different deities are tied to different cities, functions, and natural forces. Most historians agree that these gods were not just spiritual comfort, but also frameworks for understanding the world and organizing society. A careful reading might suggest that when a text says a god commands it, sometimes reflects the authority of a temple, a king, a council, or a tradition. That is not a certainty, but it is an interpretation with a practical backbone. And what if the story is pointing at something else? The word Anunnaki, in many scholarly contexts, is treated as a group of deities often associated with the underworld or the divine assembly, depending on the text and the era. That is the mainstream anchor. But a fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal cosmic beings, and that myth is coded history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain late-night charm, like a campfire story told with a straight face. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what the texts actually do, regardless of what you want them to mean. So you imagine two layers. On the first layer, you have ancient people writing about gods, because gods are how you talk about power, nature, and fate in a world without modern science, and even with modern science, honestly, because you have seen the way people talk about the weather. On the second layer, you have modern readers projecting their own concerns back into the clay, searching for hidden wars, lost technologies, cosmic conspiracies, and the comfort of thinking someone somewhere has a master plan. That second layer is where monetization goes to die if you handle it badly, so we are going to handle it gently. We are not announcing hidden truths. We are not declaring confirmations. We are listening to what is documented, noticing what is interpreted, and letting ourselves imagine calmly what if. You pick up a tablet in your mind and feel the tiny ridges under your fingertips. It's odd how physical this is. These are not floating legends. Someone pressed a stylus into mud. Someone had a bad day and still had to finish the line. Someone sneezed and smudged a sign and then had to fix it. And that matters because it keeps you anchored. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and the fact that we cannot confirm everything is not a failure. It is the whole point of history. It is a conversation with silence. Outside the scribal school, the city hums. You pass baskets of dates, jars of beer, bundles of reeds. You pass a group of workers hauling bricks, moving in rhythm like a living machine. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities depended on organized labor, and that administrative systems tracked rations and assignments. Archaeology suggests that the scale of some temple complexes required large coordinated effort. One interpretation is that when myths describe gods building or measuring or decreeing, they echo the experience of living under systems that feel larger than any individual. It's possible that a divine plan is a poetic mirror of a bureaucratic one. And now you let their imagination step in with soft shoes. What if in the way that a dream turns a loud argument into a thunderstorm, these texts turn human conflict into cosmic conflict? What if the language of factions in heaven is a way to make sense of why alliances shift, why rulers fall, why cities burn and then rebuild, why one year the grain is plentiful and the next year you are staring into an empty jar? What if the Civil War is not a literal star battle, but a symbolic stage where ancient people place the forces they cannot control? Still, it's fun to feel the chill of the bigger idea. You glance up at the night sky as if the ceiling of the scribal room has turned transparent. The stars are steady, indifferent, and somehow that steadiness makes your thoughts drift. You imagine a council of gods not as aliens in a spaceship, but as story figures seated like judges debating order and chaos. You imagine them arguing in the same way human councils argue, with pride and persuasion and fear of losing face. You imagine a split, a disagreement that becomes a fracture that becomes a narrative of civil war. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths often use divine conflict to explore themes of kingship justice and cosmic order. Historians still argue whether particular stories were meant as political commentary, theological teaching, or ritual performance, or all of the above at once. And because there is no full consensus, the safest thing we can do is hold the tablet steady, read slowly, and admit when we step from clay into cloud. You keep moving through the city. The temple tower rises layered like a staircase for the sky. You hear chanting maybe, or maybe it is just the wind catching in reeds, making that soft hush that sounds like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. A priest passes with the bowl of offerings, and you notice how the simplest objects can become sacred when the community agrees to treat them that way. Grain becomes tribute, beer becomes blessing, a lamp becomes a tiny sun in a dark corner. And that lamp is our motif tonight, that quiet pool of light on a tablet, because it reminds you of what you are doing. You are not chasing fireworks. You are staring at small marks and letting them open into big questions. That is the pace. That is the rhythm. And if you start to feel your eyelids get heavy, that is not a bug. That is the channel. Now, the first real clue you hold is this. These stories are not random. They emerge from a world with real cities, real rivers, real labour, real politics, and real anxiety about survival. Most historians agree that Sumerian civilization was shaped by the struggle to manage water and land, and by competition among city-states. Archaeology suggests patterns of growth, collapse, and reorganization over time. One interpretation is that myth becomes a way to narrate those changes so they feel meaningful rather than purely chaotic. And what if the so-called cosmic civil war is a mythic lens, a way of saying the world broke and we need to explain the sound it made? That is enough for tonight's first step. You sit with the tablet, the lamp, the hush, and the steady idea that we can keep the solid ground separate from the mist without losing the wonder. You step out of the scribal shade and into a morning that feels like someone turned the brightness up one notch too high. The air is already warm, the ground dry at the edges, and damp where irrigation water has recently passed. And everywhere you look there is proof that this landscape only becomes a home when people wrestle it into shape. Most historians agree that early Sumerian life clustered around canals, dikes and fields because in the southern Mesopotamian plain, water is both gift and threat. Archaeology suggests that irrigation agriculture supported dense populations and the rise of city-states. One interpretation is that the constant need to maintain water systems shaped not only economy but mindset, teaching people that order has to be built daily, or the river will rewrite your plans with no apology. And what if that same struggle for order is the quiet engine behind the grandest myths? You walk along a canal bank where reeds sway like a crowd of whispering listeners. Workers move in lines carrying baskets of silt, clearing blockages, patting down mud walls. Someone calls out a warning as a donkey decides to have an opinion about moving forward. You know the type. The donkey is basically an ancient comment section. Most historians agree that organised labour was central to large-scale irrigation and temple projects. The evidence we do have points to rations and assignments recorded on tablets, which implies coordination planning, and someone somewhere keeping a very unromantic spreadsheet made of clay. Historians still argue whether those labour systems were mostly communal obligations, temple-directed administration, or early forms of coercive control, depending on time and place, because the social reality likely shifted across centuries and cities. To be clear, this is debated. The past is not one single policy manual. It's a long series of improvisations, some of them working, some of them failing, and some of them surviving only as a few lines of wedge marks. You pass fields where barley heads nod in the light breeze, and you notice how the crops look almost gentle compared to the effort required to make them exist. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient texts speak about gods granting fertility or withholding it, they're not describing magic in the modern sense, but expressing a lived truth: food depends on forces bigger than you. And you need a narrative that makes those forces feel negotiable. A more cautious explanation could be that ritual is a social technology, a way to organise hope and cooperation. Still, it's possible that the language of divine favour made the seasons feel personal, like the universe could be persuaded. And what if the cosmic civil war is at least partly an emotional map of this exact feeling? You approach the city wall and realise it isn't just a defence line, it is a statement. Mud bricks stacked and plastered, repaired again and again, a boundary between organised space and the wide open plain where storms can flatten your confidence. Most historians agree that Sumerian cities developed walls and fortifications over time, and that intercity competition could turn violent. Archaeology suggests shifting political boundaries and episodes of conflict in Mesopotamian history. One interpretation is that city walls are physical versions of the same concept found in myth. The idea that order is fragile and must be defended against chaos. Inside the gate, the streets tighten. The smell changes. You pick up baked bread fish smoke and that steady earthy scent of dried mud. Vendors call out prices. Children weave between legs like quick little shadows. A potter turns a wheel and flicks water onto clay, transforming it with practiced ease. You watch and think, if only managing your life were as simple as spinning it fast and smoothing the edges. Sadly, you are not a pot, and your schedule does not politely hold its shape. The city's heart pulls you forward. A temple complex rises with courtyards, storage rooms, and altars. What's broadly accepted is that temples were central nodes in Sumerian urban life, connected to religion, economy, and governance. The evidence we do have points to offerings, inventories, and land management tied to temple institutions. One interpretation is that gods in texts can function as symbols of a temple's authority or a city's identity, because when the temple says the god commands, that carries weight. That is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's a possibility, not a certainty. You pause by an offering table and notice how ordinary the items are. Grain oil, maybe a small figurine, maybe a cloth. Nothing screams cosmic warfare. And yet the very ordinariness is the point. Myth does not float above life. It sits on a table in the form of food, and someone has to bring it, and someone has to record it, and someone has to decide who gets credit for the abundance. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these offerings was devotional, redistributive, political, or all at once, because in a temple economy, the sacred and the practical intertwine so tightly you cannot separate them without tearing the fabric. Scholars continue to debate how much power priests held relative to kings in different periods. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of what keeps the story alive. Now you walk towards the ziggurat, not yet thinking of it as a staircase to the stars, but as a mountain built by hands in a flat land. Archaeology suggests these monumental platforms served as ritual centres, and most historians agree that they were symbols of city pride and religious devotion. One interpretation is that the act of building upward was a way to perform the idea of connecting earth and sky. And what if, in the imagination of the people who watched it rise, the ziggurat was a diplomatic bridge between competing powers, a place where heavenly factions might be negotiated with, not fought? This is where you begin to feel the tug of the phrase Anunnaki again, not as a headline, but as a category within a worldview. In many mainstream readings, these are divine figures within Mesopotamian religion. They are part of a cosmic order, not necessarily a cosmic battlefield. Yet a popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were divided, that there was a celestial schism, that the gods took sides. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you can see why it appeals. Human life in a city-state is full of factions. There are guilds, households, temple administrators, palace officials, neighbouring cities, with grudges, alliances that last until the next drought. When you live inside that, you might imagine even heaven has politics. A careful reading might suggest that divine rivalries in myth could echo the real rivalries between cities. For example, when one city's god is praised as supreme, it may reflect that city's rising status. This raises the possibility that myths were not just bedtime entertainment, but also cultural messaging, a way of saying our city matters, our patron is powerful, our order is legitimate. That is not a hidden truth. It is a plausible lens historians sometimes use to interpret how religion and politics reinforce each other. Historians still argue whether specific myths were composed primarily for ritual performance, royal propaganda, or theological reflection, because texts can serve many purposes across time. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You walk through a market and notice seals pressed into clay on jars and doors. The seal images are tiny worlds, animals, figures, symbols, sometimes scenes that look like a story condensed into a stamp. Archaeology suggests cylinder seals were widely used for authentication and identity, and most historians agree they played a role in administration and trade. One interpretation is that the constant use of seals taught people that authority is something you imprint, something you mark and recognize. And what if that habit of stamping identity into clay also shaped myth-making cosmic order feel like something official, something recorded and enforceable? You stop by a canal again inside the city, a narrow water channel running between walls. Someone is cleaning it, because water management is the city's ongoing obsession. You listen to the water gurgle and think of it as a soft soundtrack, like the fan hum you might have on in your room right now. That sound becomes a reminder that the city is built on moving water, and the stories are built on moving meaning. Now you let your imagination do one careful monetization safe step into the mist. What if the cosmic civil war is not a literal event in the sky, but a dramatic language for political fragmentation and reunification on Earth. What if factions among gods are a mirror for factions among people? What if the winners of human conflicts tell their story as the winners of divine conflicts? And what if when a city falls, the myth shifts too, because even the heavens have to reorganize when the archives change hands? That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Most historians agree that Sumerian myths reflect religious beliefs and cultural values, and archaeology grounds those beliefs in a real material world of temples, canals, and city administration. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and the gaps invite a calm, curious what if. You leave the ziggurat courtyard with dust on your sandals and sunlight on your shoulders. The city continues around you alive, practical, noisy, and somewhere within that ordinary life, stories about the divine begin to gather like clouds at the edge of a clear sky, hinting that if order can be built, it can also be broken, and if it can be broken, people will imagine a reason. You drift deeper into the city and start noticing that almost everything has two lives. A jar of barley is food, but it is also a unit on an account tablet. A doorway is an entrance, but it is also a place for a seal impression that says who controls what passes through. A prayer is devotion, but it is also a public signal that you belong to a community that agrees on which powers matter. Most historians agree that Sumerian city life blended the sacred and the administrative, especially around temple institutions. Archaeology suggests that many tablets were practical records, yet the same writing system also carried hymns and myths. One interpretation is that once a society learns to manage itself through records, it may begin to imagine the cosmos through similar structures, like a divine bureaucracy with rules, ranks, and consequences. And what if that is the real doorway into our cosmic civil war mood? Not rockets and lasers, but paperwork that feels eternal. You follow a narrow lane to a building with a shaded courtyard and cool walls. Inside, you find what looks like an office, except the desk is low and the documents are clay. A scribe sits with a stylus, making neat impressions with the calm focus of someone who has accepted that their entire career is basically making tiny triangles in mud. You want to ask how their wrist survives. They probably want to ask why you keep staring like you have never seen a spreadsheet before. Most historians agree that scribes were essential to administration in Mesopotamian societies, recording rations, taxes, labour obligations, and transactions. The evidence we do have points to standardised formats and repeating phrases that suggest routine governance. One interpretation is that this habit of listing and categorizing did more than organize grain. It organized thought. It gave people a way to define roles, responsibilities, and order. When you live in a world where everything can be tallied, you might also imagine that even the gods have portfolios. Historians still argue whether the growth of bureaucracy primarily strengthened communal stability or entrenched inequality, because records can protect people, but they can also control them. To be clear, this is debated. You can feel it in the room. A tablet is neutral clay, yet the numbers on it can decide whether you eat well or barely. That is a power you can taste. Now you wander toward the temple again, but not as a tourist. You walk like someone who knows that the temple is also a warehouse, a courthouse, a bank, and a stage. What's broadly accepted is that temples were major economic institutions managing land labour and surplus. Archaeology suggests large storage capacities and administrative activity tied to temple complexes. A careful reading might suggest that when texts describe offerings to a deity, they are also describing flows of resources through an institution that claims divine authority. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Gods are not just metaphors. People truly believed in them, prayed to them, feared displeasing them, and celebrated them. But institutions can also use belief, intentionally or not, to coordinate society. It is possible that religious language and administrative reality reinforced each other, creating a system where cosmic order and social order felt like the same thing. You watch a line of workers carrying baskets into a storage room. An overseer checks quantities. A scribe notes it down. A priest blesses the goods. It is all one motion, like three different languages describing the same act. Most historians agree that these societies depended on coordinated management of resources. One interpretation is that the idea of divine command gives moral weight to practical decisions, which makes cooperation easier or at least harder to refuse. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of early urban organisation was temple leadership, palace leadership, or a shifting balance between them, because evidence varies across time and city. Scholars continue to debate how kingship evolved from earlier forms of leadership. There's no full consensus, and in that uncertainty, you can see how myths might become tools, not necessarily cynical tools, but stories that help a community explain who should lead and why. Now the phrase Anunnaki returns with a slightly different texture. In mainstream readings, it is a group term for certain deities within Mesopotamian tradition, part of an ordered cosmos. Yet the popular rumour claims that these beings were not merely gods, but a kind of ruling class from elsewhere, complete with internal politics, and a split that erupted into war. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a lens. It becomes a way to ask how texts portray hierarchy and conflict among divine figures, and what that might reflect in human life. You notice something else. The city runs on relationships. Households, kin, networks, patronage alliances between families and institutions. Most historians agree that social structure was layered with different classes and roles. Archaeology suggests variation in housing and burial practices that may correlate with status. One interpretation is that when myths describe councils of gods, rankings, and decrees, they echo the experience of living under layered authority, where decisions come from above and you adapt below. And what if the cosmic civil war, in its most sleep-friendly form, is simply the heavens acting out a political struggle the city already knows by heart? You move into a public space where a dispute is being handled. Two men argue about a boundary. A third insists the boundary has always been there. Someone produces a seal impression as evidence. The crowd listens. The judge or elder or official makes a decision. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies developed legal traditions and that written records could play a role in disputes. The evidence we do have points to contracts and law codes in later periods, and earlier administrative records show the habit of documenting transactions. One interpretation is that writing made authority portable because a tablet can travel and the record travels with it. Historians still argue whether justice in these settings was primarily about fairness, stability, or reinforcing hierarchy, because the same system can do all three. To be clear, this is debated, but you can feel the human need for order, the desire for a line you can point to and say, this is mine, this is yours, this is how we avoid chaos. Now imagine turning that need upward. If people crave boundaries on earth, they might imagine boundaries in the sky. If people fear disputes, they might imagine disputes among gods. If people need courts, they might imagine councils. If people need decrees, they might imagine divine tablets, cosmic laws, sacred destinies. A fringe idea proposes that this is literal, that the heavens truly held a political struggle and the tablets preserve hints of it. Again, this theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that humans narrate their world through familiar structures, so the cosmos becomes a larger version of the city. And what if the story is pointing at something else, not because it hides a secret war, but because it reveals how ancient minds connected governance and the divine? You step into a small shrine where the air smells of oil and smoke. A lamp flickers. You watch the flame and notice how it makes the walls feel alive, like the shadows are listening. You catch yourself holding your breath the way people do when they want something to matter. Most historians agree that household religion and temple religion both existed, and that people interacted with the divine in daily life. Archaeology suggests figurines and small altars in domestic contexts. One interpretation is that the divine was not distant. It was woven into ordinary routines, the same routines that made bureaucracy possible. Now you realise something quietly unsettling in a non-scary way. When a society merges, the sacred with administration disagreement becomes more than a policy argument. It becomes a cosmic argument. If two factions disagree about leadership, it can be framed as two divine wills in conflict. If a city loses a war, it can be framed as a god withdrawing favour. If a new dynasty rises, it can be framed as divine appointment. These are not lies. They are stories that help people cope with uncertainty. Historians still argue whether myths were primarily used to legitimize rulers or to express communal values independent of rulers, because both forces can be present. The evidence we do have points to texts that praise kings and texts that explore cosmic themes. There's no full consensus, and that is why your imagination gets room to breathe. So you keep your feet on the ground and your gaze on the sky at the same time. Documented facts give you the city, the canals, the temples, the scribes, the seals. Interpretation offers you the idea that gods can mirror institutions and conflicts, and gentle imagination offers you a cinematic mood where the heavens look like a grand court, where factions whisper, where decrees crack like distant thunder, where a cosmic civil war could be a mythic way of saying order was contested. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And as you step back into the sunlit street, you feel the city's pulse under your sandals, like the world itself is keeping time one clay mark at a time. You leave the administrative bustle behind and drift towards something that feels more ceremonial, like the city is taking a deep breath and letting its memory speak. A gathering is happening in an open courtyard, and the mood is not frantic like the market or sharp like the court. It is steady. People stand in clusters, trading quiet remarks, and you can tell this is the kind of moment where names matter. Not your name, their names, the ones that get remembered. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian rulers used inscriptions, monuments, and official records to project legitimacy and continuity. The evidence we do have points to king lists and royal claims that blend historical memory with ideology. One interpretation is that a king list is not just a list, but a story about order, a way of saying the world has a sequence, a line that should not be broken. And what if in the sleep-friendly glow of imagination, the idea of a cosmic civil war begins not with flying chariots in space, but with a question as simple as who has the right to rule? You picture a clay tablet being held like a precious thing. It is not ornate, but it is authoritative. Names are pressed into it like footprints that refuse to fade. Some reign lengths are plausible, some are astonishing. The famous long lifespans are the part that makes modern readers lean in like they just heard a rumour in a hallway. A popular rumour claims those numbers are proof of non-human rulers or evidence of a lost age when humans lived far longer. To be clear, this is debated. Most historians agree that early sections of king lists include legendary elements, and that reign lengths may be symbolic rather than literal. Historians still argue whether those extended reigns represent mythic time, a different counting system, political propaganda, or a ritualized way of magnifying the past, because the list seems to perform memory as much as it records it. That debate matters because it shows you the core tension in all this. The tablets can be real, the writing can be real, the names can be real, and still the meaning can be layered. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You let the solid ground settle first. Archaeology suggests that Sumerian city-states rose and fell, that dynasties shifted, and that power moved across the landscape like a torch passed in a storm. What's broadly accepted is that kingship became a central political form tied to warfare, land control, temple relations, and public works. You can almost hear the practical side of it. A king is someone who can organise labour, defend borders, negotiate alliances, and keep the canals working, because if the canals fail, the city does not get a second chance. Now you let interpretation step in with a gentle hand. One interpretation is that king lists function as a bridge between chaos and order, smoothing over messy transitions by presenting a clean line. A careful reading might suggest that the list can legitimize the present by anchoring it to a grand past, even if the past is partly mythic. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it makes sense in a world where authority needs stories to stand on. And what if the cosmic civil war mood enters right here through the idea that legitimacy itself can be contested at the highest level? In the courtyard, a storyteller recites names with a rhythm that feels like a spell. The crowd murmurs at familiar ones. Some names carry pride, others carry warnings. You listen and notice how a list can feel like a map, not of geography, but of identity. It tells you who belongs in the chain of order and who does not. Most historians agree that ancient societies used genealogies and king lists to structure memory. Archaeology suggests that writing was often tied to institutions that benefited from stable narratives. One interpretation is that a list can function like a cosmic rulebook, implying that order comes from a recognized sequence, not from random force. And what if in mythic terms a civil war among divine beings is the ultimate nightmare version of a broken list, a universe where even heaven cannot agree on succession? A fringe idea proposes that the king list is a coded record of non-human rulers that the Anunnaki once governed directly, and that their internal split left traces in the reign sequence. This theory isn't widely accepted, but we can treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, and notice what it invites you to do. It invites you to read the list as a clue to scan it the way you scan a sky for patterns, looking for interruptions, anomalies, sudden changes that feel like something snapped. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that anomalies arise because the list was compiled later, drawing from different traditions, political aims, and mythic storytelling habits. Historians still argue whether the list's purpose was primarily historical record, theological statement, political propaganda, or a blend that shifts over time. There's no full consensus, and that lack of consensus is exactly why the list can be both fascinating and slippery. You step away from the crowd and imagine the king list as a long corridor lined with doors. Each door is a reign, a city, a dynasty. Some doors open into clear rooms, others open into fog. You can walk the corridor, but you cannot always see what is inside. That is history. Now the city's architecture starts to echo this corridor idea. You pass a palace compound that feels different from the temple precinct. More guards, more controlled access, more of that quiet tension that says decisions are made here that affect everyone else. Most historians agree that palace institutions developed alongside temple institutions, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. Archaeology suggests changes in administrative patterns and material culture that may reflect shifting political organization. One interpretation is that the palace and temple represent two centers of authority that need each other and also challenge each other. The temple claims cosmic legitimacy. The palace claims military and executive legitimacy. And what if the cosmic civil war is a mythic reflection of that tension, a story that turns institutional rivalry into divine rivalry, so it feels inevitable and meaningful rather than awkward and human? Historians still argue whether early kings were primarily temple officials, war leaders, or a hybrid role that evolved over time because the evidence is complex and varies by region. That debate is your reminder that the categories you want, like religion versus politics, are modern preferences, not ancient realities. You stop near a workshop where artisans carve stone weave textiles and craft objects that will end up in temples or palaces. It occurs to you that every object is part of the legitimacy machine. A finely made seal is not just art, it is identity. A carved inscription is not just writing, it is authority made visible. Most historians agree that material culture played a role in expressing power. Archaeology suggests that elite goods and monumental works were used to signal status and divine favour. Now you let imagination slip in again softly like a blanket pulled up just an inch. What if the Civil War is cosmic because legitimacy is cosmic? What if in the ancient mind the right to rule is not merely political, but woven into the fabric of the universe? If the universe has order, the city must have order. If the city has a king, the heavens must have a high god. If the king list is broken, it feels like the sky itself is cracking. That is a mood, not a proof. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You look up at the ziggurat in the distance and think about how its tiers resemble a list made of bricks. Step by step, level by level, a climb that suggests sequence. A careful reading might suggest that architecture itself teaches the mind to think in hierarchies and ordered layers. And what if, when a myth speaks of gods ranked in councils, it is echoing the way a city sees itself structured, from labourers up to elites, from earth up to sky? A popular rumour claims that somewhere in the old lists and hymns there is a hidden account of a war that split the Anunnaki, and that the long reigns hint at an age when divine rulers walked openly. This isn't widely accepted, but you can feel the narrative pull. It turns an administrative artifact into a thriller. It turns a list into a battlefield. And yet the calm truth is more subtle and maybe more interesting for a sleep-friendly channel. Even without literal aliens, the list shows you something profound. It shows you how people use story to tame time. It shows you how power needs continuity. It shows you how a society tries to make sense of upheaval by arranging rulers into a meaningful sequence. Historians still argue whether the king list preserves kernels of genuine early dynastic memory or mostly retroactive ideology, because the line between memory and myth is not clean. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You leave the courtyard as the recitation fades behind you. The sun slides a little lower, softening the harsh edges of the day. The city continues its routines, but your mind holds the corridor of names and the feeling that order is always being constructed, defended, narrated. And in that gentle space between clay and sky, the idea of a cosmic civil war lingers as a question, not an answer, like a star you can see but cannot touch. You wander into a part of the city where the air tastes different, sharp, with the scent of smoke and hot metal, and you immediately understand that this is where people make things that last longer than a season. A workshop district hums with soundhammer strikes, bellows, sighing clay vessels clinking a goat, making a complaint about nothing in particular. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities supported specialized crafts, including metallurgy, pottery weaving, and toolmaking. Archaeology suggests workshops and production areas tied to both temple and palace demand. One interpretation is that when a society builds complex material culture, it also builds complex metaphors, because the language of making becomes a language for power. And what if the cosmic civil war mood is forged here in the vocabulary of thunder and tools? You stop near a smith whose arms look like they were designed by someone who hates leisure. He heats metal until it glows, then shapes it with rhythmic precision. Sparks leap like tiny meteors and die before they hit the ground. You watch and think, if you were in charge of the universe, you would absolutely use this as a metaphor. Fire force transformation. Even the sound has authority. Most historians agree that metalwork and weapon production mattered in ancient warfare and status display. The evidence we do have points to increasing military organisation over time and the role of elite equipment in signalling power. A careful reading might suggest that when myths describe divine weapons, they are using the most impressive human technology of the time as a language for overwhelming force. That is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, the imagery is hard to ignore. Storm gods, thunder, lightning, the kind of sky violence you can feel in your bones even before the rain hits. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often connect deities with natural forces, especially storms and fertility. Archaeology suggests people lived with extreme weather and relied on seasonal patterns they could not control. One interpretation is that a storm god represents both awe and fear, but also authority, because storms do not ask permission. And what if in the cinematic what if layer the language of storms becomes the language of factional power, as if heavenly politics has weather? Historians still argue whether storm god supremacy in certain periods reflects shifting political centres, ecological pressures, or theological developments, because the reasons can overlap. There's no full consensus, and that debate keeps you grounded. The gods are not just characters, they are mirrors for changing realities. You walk past a wall painted with symbols, and notice that even decoration feels like messaging. Someone wants you to remember who is strong, who is protected, who is blessed. Most historians agree that iconography and ritual reinforced social order. The evidence we do have points to symbols repeating across objects, seals, and temple spaces. One interpretation is that repeated imagery trains the mind like a lullaby trains you to relax. It teaches you what to expect. It teaches you who is in charge. Now, a popular rumour claims that when texts describe heavenly weapons or divine battles, they are literally recording advanced technology used in an Anunnaki war. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient authors described power using the most intense sensory experiences they knew: storms, fire, metal roaring noise, blinding light. That doesn't make the stories less interesting, it makes them more human. If we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it prompts a gentle question. Why do so many myths across cultures reach for the language of sky-fire when describing ultimate conflict? A careful reading might suggest that the sky is the biggest stage available, so it becomes the place where cosmic stakes are performed. And what if, for Sumerian writers, imagining a civil war among divine forces was the most dramatic way to explain why order sometimes collapses despite everyone's best efforts? You move into a courtyard where soldiers train not in a cinematic montage way, but in the awkward reality of practice. One man trips and pretends it was intentional, another smirks and then immediately gets corrected by someone older who has the calm of a person who has seen too much and survived anyway. Most historians agree that warfare between city-states occurred in Mesopotamia and that military organisation developed over time. Archaeology suggests fortifications and weapon finds that support a history of conflict. Historians still argue whether early conflicts were primarily raids, territorial disputes, or more structured campaigns, because evidence is uneven and later texts can romanticize. To be clear, this is debated. But the presence of training bodies and weapons in the city makes one thing obvious. Violence is not an abstract concept here. It is a possibility that always sits near the edge of ordinary life, like a storm cloud that might or might not break. Now the story logic snaps into place. When people live with the reality of war, they often mythologize it. They turn human conflict into divine conflict, not because they are naive, but because it gives shape to fear. It gives a reason. It creates a sense that chaos is not random, that it has a narrative you can follow. One interpretation is that divine battles in myth can encode social memory of real conflicts, migrations, or political upheavals. That is not a certainty. It's possible, and the evidence can be thin depending on the text. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You pause under a shaded awning as a wind picks up. Dust swirls in little spirals, and for a moment you can see why people would personify forces like this. The wind feels alive. It does not care what you planned. It simply arrives, rearranges the world, and moves on. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians read meaning into natural events and developed omen traditions. Archaeology suggests the importance of ritual and divination in many periods. A careful reading might suggest that when a text uses weather language for divine anger, it is expressing a worldview where nature is part of moral order. And what if the cosmic civil war is described like weather? Because weather is the closest everyday analogy to forces beyond human control. You hear a priest chant near a small shrine using words that roll like thunder, but in a controlled, practiced cadence. You cannot make out every phrase, but you feel the rhythm. It is designed to hold attention and soothe anxiety at the same time, a little like this channel, except with more incense and fewer comments asking for a part 2. Most historians agree that hymns and ritual texts played roles in temple life. The evidence we do have points to structured religious literature. One interpretation is that these texts reinforce the idea of cosmic order positioning deities as guarantors of stability. Now bring in the civil war idea as a question. If deities guarantee order, what happens when they disagree? This is where the imagination can become cinematic without becoming misleading. What if the old stories are staging a moral argument in the sky? What if one faction represents strict authority, another represents clever negotiation, another represents compassion or craft or fertility? What if their conflict is not about laser beams, but about competing visions of how the universe should run? A cosmic civil war in that sense becomes a mythic courtroom, a thunderstorm of ideologies. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mainstream anchor is that myths are literary and religious works shaped by cultural context. Historians still argue whether specific divine conflicts should be read as historical allegory, theological metaphor, or ritual drama, because the texts can function on multiple levels. A fringe idea proposes that the heavenly weapons are literal evidence of advanced beings. Again, this isn't widely accepted, but we can notice how that idea emerges from the same human impulse. When something feels too powerful, you assume the source must be beyond you. In ancient times, the storm is beyond you. In modern times, technology is beyond you. So the mind connects them. You return to the workshop district and watch the smith quench a blade in water. Steam rises hissing, and the sound is oddly calming, like a kettle turning off. The blade darkens. It looks finished, but you know it will be sharpened, polished, tested. Most historians agree that tools and weapons required skilled labour and resources. Archaeology suggests trade networks that supplied metals and stones. One interpretation is that the complexity of production reflects broader systems of organisation and exchange. And what if those same networks of exchange and competition, those same systems of resource control, are the real fuel behind stories of conflict, whether human or divine? You walk away as the sun begins to soften. The city settles into an evening rhythm, and the wind carries distant chanting like a low note. You hold on to the idea that the language of thunder might be metaphor, that divine weapons might be poetic technology, and that a cosmic civil war could be an imaginative frame for competing powers, competing visions, competing claims to order. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and in the glow of a fading day, the sky looks wide enough to hold every question you're too tired to answer. You slip into a quieter quarter of the city, where the streets feel less like commerce and more like conversation. The buildings lean inward, creating shade, and the air cools just enough to make you breathe slower. Somewhere water trickles through a narrow channel, and somewhere else a cooking fire gives off a gentle smell of onions and bread. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was not a single uniform system, but a web of local cults and major deities whose importance shifted across regions and time. Archaeology suggests that different cities emphasized different gods, building temples and rituals around them. One interpretation is that when myths portray divine rivalries, those rivalries can reflect real differences in regional identity and political allegiance. And what if the cosmic civil war mood begins as a disagreement about how order should be maintained? You step into a small courtyard where two neighbours argue about something ordinary. One insists on a rule, the other insists on a workaround. You watch them and think, congratulations, you have just reenacted the whole history of governance. Some people want structure, some people want flexibility. Both think they are saving the world. And honestly, both might be right depending on the day. Now you let that human pattern rise into the divine names that often dominate later retellings, Enlil and Enki. Most historians agree that these are major deities in Mesopotamian tradition, though specific roles and stories vary by period and text tradition. The evidence we do have points to Enlil often associated with authority, kingship, and the air or storm domain in some contexts, while Enki is often linked with water wisdom, craft, and cleverness in many narratives. A careful reading might suggest that the contrast between them offers a storytelling engine, rule and restraint, versus ingenuity and mediation. Historians still argue whether the prominence of certain deities reflects primarily theological development, political dominance of specific city centres, or the practical needs of society, because these forces can overlap. There's no full consensus, and that is your reminder not to treat any single storyline as universal. You walk along a wall where a relief shows a figure pouring water from a vessel, streams flowing outward like veins. You can't help thinking how obsessed this land is with water. Water makes fields. Water floods fields. Water is life and disaster in the same breath. Archaeology suggests irrigation was foundational, and most historians agree that water management shaped settlement and power. One interpretation is that water, deities, and water imagery become central because they match lived reality. And what if in the cinematic what if layer, the very elements associated with these gods become banners in a cosmic dispute? Air and command versus water and cunning. Not a battle of good and evil, but a clash of approaches. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki War was a literal factional conflict led by opposing divine leaders, sometimes mapped onto names like these. This theory isn't widely accepted, but we can treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, and ask a gentler question: why do stories so often focus on rival leaders? A more cautious explanation could be that human societies experience power through leadership and rivalry. So myth dramatizes that tension through divine personalities. You keep walking and notice how the city itself is arranged like a hierarchy. There are wide spaces near major institutions and tighter lanes near ordinary homes. There are guarded entrances and open courtyards. There are people whose clothing looks cleaner and people whose hands look like they are permanently stained by work. Most historians agree that social stratification existed in Mesopotamian societies, though it varied by time and place. Archaeology suggests differences in housing and goods that may reflect status. One interpretation is that cosmic hierarchies in myth mirror social hierarchies on Earth, making the universe feel familiar. Historians still argue whether particular myths about divine councils and decrees were intended to justify existing hierarchies or simply explain cosmic order as people understood it. because texts can serve multiple roles. To be clear, this is debated. It's also why the same story can feel comforting to one listener and frustrating to another. You enter a temple courtyard where the evening ritual is starting. The light is softer now and lamps begin to glow. You hear a chant that repeats in patterns, not for excitement, but for steadiness. Most historians agree that ritual repetition helps create social cohesion and a sense of cosmic regularity. The evidence we do have points to structured liturgy in later periods and religious texts that emphasize order. One interpretation is that ritual exists to keep the world from wobbling too much, at least emotionally. And what if a myth about divine conflict is not meant to destabilize you but to reassure you? Because even if the gods argue, the story ends with some form of restored order which tells the listener chaos can be contained. Now imagine the mythic stage carefully. You picture a divine assembly not as a space station boardroom, but as a symbolic council where the universe negotiates with itself. One faction favours strict decree, clear lines, direct enforcement. Another favours clever solutions, hidden channels, negotiated compromises. This is gentle imagination. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm. What if imagination? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that mythic narratives use divine characters to explore moral, social, and cosmological questions. Historians still argue whether specific rivalries should be read as reflections of intercity politics, ecological concerns, or internal theological discourse, because the evidence can support multiple readings. You see a group of priests discussing something with temple officials. Their voices are low and their gestures are precise. It looks like a meeting that could be about ritual timing or about resource allocation or both. The city does not separate these categories. A careful reading might suggest that when gods in myth disagree, it could echo the real experience of institutions disagreeing, because in a complex society, power is distributed across centres and roles. This is where the civil war framing becomes a useful question rather than a claim. If a society experiences competing centres of authority, it might imagine competing centres of divine authority. If a city struggles with balancing control and flexibility, it might narrate that as a cosmic tension. And what if the phrase cosmic civil war is simply a modern way of describing a mythic theme that is ancient? The universe contains competing forces and order depends on how they negotiate. A fringe idea proposes that the rivalry is literal history, that advanced beings fought and the echoes became myth. Again, this isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the safe, grounded way to explore the idea is to keep returning to what is documented, changing cult centres, shifting political dominance, the human need to narrate power. You step into a riverside area where the canal meets the broader flow. The water reflects the first stars. You think about how a river can split into branches and then rejoin, and how that is a perfect image for faction and reunion. One interpretation is that water imagery in myth can symbolize mediation and continuity, And what if in the cinematic layer, the cosmos is a river too, splitting into factions, then slowly finding its way back into one channel? Historians still argue whether the evolution of major deity roles reflects conquest, trade, migration, or internal cultural change, because the record is patchy and the past is stubbornly complex. But you do not need a final answer to feel the atmosphere of it. You can simply stand there listening to the water, letting your mind take the shape of the city, structured, layered, full of negotiation. And in that calm, you hold the idea that the biggest conflicts are not always about destruction. Sometimes they are about governance, about whose rules apply, about whether order is imposed or persuaded, about whether the universe is a strict ledger or a clever river system that finds a way around obstacles. You breathe out. The lamps behind you flicker. The sky above you opens wider. You follow the sound of voices into a larger open space where the city seems to pause for something official. The air is cooler now, and the lamps have taken over from the sun, casting soft halos that make faces look gentler than they probably were at noon. In the centre, a group stands in a loose circle, talking with that careful tone people use when every word might matter later. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies developed formal procedures for decision-making, record-keeping, and dispute resolution, even if the exact structures varied by city and era. Archaeology suggests administrative complexity and social hierarchies that required coordination. One interpretation is that when myths describe councils of gods issuing decrees, they echo the lived experience of councils, courts, and assemblies in human life. And what if tonight the cosmic civil war begins as a vote you can almost hear? You imagine a scribe nearby quietly noting what is said. Not every phrase maybe, but the essence. Who proposed what? Who agreed? Who hesitated? A careful reading might suggest that the drama of decision-making is itself a sacred theme, because a city only survives if decisions are made, even imperfect ones. The evidence we do have points to the importance of written records in administration, which implies that decisions were not just spoken. They were fixed, preserved, and used later. That makes a decree feel heavy, like it has gravity. Historians still argue whether early city governance involved broad assemblies of citizens, councils of elders, temple officials, royal authority, or shifting combinations, because evidence is uneven and later sources can idealize. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is your reminder to treat every neat structure with caution. You watch the circle in the courtyard and notice the choreography of power. Some people speak and others nod. Some people speak and others look away like they are counting in their heads. One person says little, but everyone waits when they finally do speak. Most historians agree that social hierarchy shaped who had voice and influence. Archaeology suggests status differences visible in housing and material culture. One interpretation is that public decision spaces were not purely democratic, but they were still social theatres where legitimacy had to be performed. Now bring in the divine mirror. In myth, a council of gods gathers. They argue, they weigh consequences, they make decrees that shape cosmic order. This is documented in the sense that many Mesopotamian narratives include divine assemblies and formal pronouncements. But the meaning is interpreted. One interpretation is that these assemblies reflect human governance structures, making divine order feel familiar and enforceable. And what if the cosmic civil war is not a single battle scene, but a procedural breakdown, a moment when the council cannot agree and the universe feels briefly ungoverned? A popular rumour claims that these council scenes are literal memory of an advanced ruling group making decisions about Earth, with factions splitting in a cosmic civil war. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that councils appear in myth because councils were a real part of managing complex societies, and people naturally project their most important social mechanisms onto the cosmos. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You walk along the edge of the courtyard and overhear the topic. It's about a canal repair, which sounds boring until you realise is about survival. Someone argues for immediate labour mobilisation. Someone argues for postponing until after a festival. Someone else suggests dividing the work across households. You can almost see the cosmic metaphor forming on its own. Order requires sacrifice. Timing matters. Everyone wants a solution that does not upset their own life too much, which is frankly timeless. Most historians agree that maintaining irrigation systems required cooperation and coordination, and that failures could lead to serious consequences. Archaeology suggests both the importance of canals and the vulnerability of settlements to environmental shifts. One interpretation is that the need for collective action shaped the moral language of the culture, encouraging stories that frame cooperation as divinely favoured. Historians still argue whether major societal collapses in Mesopotamian history were driven more by climate stress, political conflict, economic strain, or complex interactions, because the record supports multiple factors. That debate is your anchor. Real history is complicated. Myths can simplify it into characters and factions, which makes it easier to remember and easier to emotionally digest. You step away and enter a temple annex where a priest is preparing ritual objects. They arrange items with the precision of someone setting a table for invisible guests. A lamp oil, a small bowl, a cloth. Nothing flashy, no cosmic artillery, just careful attention. Most historians agree that ritual practice involves structured preparation and repeated actions. The evidence we do have points to the importance of correct performance in many religious systems. One interpretation is that ritual is a rehearsal of order, a way of practicing stability. And what if the idea of a divine council is also a rehearsal, a story form that teaches listeners that decisions can be made, that conflict can be adjudicated, that chaos can be contained? Now imagine the Civil War idea as a question inside the council. What if there is disagreement about the rules? What if one faction insists on strict enforcement and another insists on compassion or negotiation? What if they argue not about territory but about governance philosophy? That is gentle imagination. It is possible, not certain. It helps you explore how myth can dramatize competing values. A fringe idea proposes that the council scenes are not metaphor, but literal political meetings of non-human beings. Again, this isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A careful reading might suggest that the more reliable insight is not whether the council was real in a literal sense, but why the story uses a council. It uses it because it feels authoritative. It feels like law. It feels like the universe has minutes and agendas. Historians still argue whether the portrayal of divine law in Mesopotamian texts reflects an emerging concept of universal justice, or primarily reinforces local authority structures, because the distinction is not always clear. To be clear, this is debated. But you can feel how a society that relies on contracts and seals would also rely on the idea that the cosmos itself is contractual. You walk through a corridor lined with tablets set in shelves, drying or stored. The smell is dusty and calm. It reminds you of old books, but with more clay and less paper cuts. You think about how a contract on a tablet can outlive the people who signed it. That permanence makes obligations feel real even when the original voices are gone. Now you let the cinematic mood rise. What if the cosmic civil war is the story of a contract, broken at the highest level? What if the gods, like humans, make oaths, and like humans sometimes break them? What if that rupture shakes the structure of reality, not because lasers explode, but because trust collapses? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the most haunting conflicts are often the ones that begin as disagreements in a room, not battles in a field. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myth uses divine conflict to explore themes of order and disorder, authority and rebellion. One interpretation is that these stories reflect social experiences of governance and power. And what if, by framing conflict as a debate among gods, the culture creates a safe space to think about conflict without directly accusing human leaders? You return to the courtyard as the meeting ends. People disperse in small groups, still talking, still weighing. The decision has been made, but the consequences have not yet arrived. That is always the eerie part of decisions. They are quiet at first. You look up at the sky and see stars scattered like seal impressions stamped into darkness. You imagine a cosmic council, an argument, a decree, a faction that refuses. You do not need to believe it happened literally to feel the atmosphere of it. You can treat it as possibility rather than conclusion, and let it guide your curiosity. The lamps flicker, the city settles, and somewhere in the hush you can almost hear the sound of a stylus pressing into clay as if the universe itself is recording the meeting. You wake to the subtle feeling that the city never truly sleeps. It only changes tempo. Night air drifts through narrow lanes, cooler now, carrying the smell of river water and baked brick that has finally stopped roasting in the sun. Somewhere a dog barks once, then thinks better of it, because even dogs know the hours when noise feels disrespectful. You follow a soft line of lamplight toward a small doorway where two figures meet close to the wall, speaking in low voices, like they are afraid the night itself might take notes. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies relied heavily on agreements, land leases, labour obligations, trade arrangements, and sworn promises recorded on tablets or witnessed in ritual. The evidence we do have points to contracts and seals used to establish trust across time and distance. One interpretation is that when a culture builds its stability on oaths and records, it will also imagine the cosmos as oath-bound, as if reality itself is a contract. And what if the cosmic civil war begins with a promise broken, not with a weapon raised? You step closer and notice what they hold: a small piece of clay, still damp enough to accept a seal. One person speaks, the other nods, and the seal is pressed. The imprint is tiny, but it changes everything. Suddenly, this is not just a conversation. It is an obligation with teeth. Most historians agree that sealing practices serve to authenticate and enforce agreements. Archaeology suggests seals were widespread and symbolically important. A careful reading might suggest that the power of an oath is not only moral but social, because the community agrees to punish the breaker. Historians still argue whether the enforcement of contracts was primarily legal, religious, communal, or a shifting mix depending on context, because the mechanisms of control evolved and varied. There's no full consensus, which means you should picture enforcement not as a modern courtroom, but as a network of institutions and relationships that could tighten around you if you broke trust. You walk on and pass a shrine tucked into a corner, its lamp burning steadily. The flame looks peaceful, but it is also a reminder that witnesses do not have to be human. Many societies treat the divine as the ultimate observer. Most historians agree that religion and law often intertwined in ancient contexts. Archaeology suggests ritual spaces embedded in everyday environments. One interpretation is that swearing an oath before a deity makes it harder to break because the consequences feel cosmic, not just social. Now, the idea of a divine civil war shifts from spectacle to something more intimate. What if the biggest fracture is not a clash of armies, but a collapse of shared rules? What if a faction in the heavens decides that the old agreement no longer applies? What if another faction insists it does? And what if that disagreement echoes the human fear that keeps you awake? Sometimes the fear that the rules you rely on might suddenly fail. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths include themes of order threatened by chaos and restored through divine action. One interpretation is that these themes reflect real social concerns about stability and justice. A popular rumour claims that certain ancient stories hint at a war among the Anunnaki sparked by betrayal, broken oaths, or factional rebellion. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it encourages you to look for the storytelling logic of betrayal, why it matters, what it symbolises, how it functions as a moral warning. You walk toward a warehouse district where goods are stored under guard. It's quiet now, but you can sense the weight of what is inside grain that equals survival wool, that equals trade metal, that equals tools and weapons. Most historians agree that control of surplus and trade resources played a major role in power dynamics. Archaeology suggests extensive trade networks connecting Mesopotamia to distant regions for materials. One interpretation is that many conflicts, even when framed as ideology, are also about resources. Historians still argue whether specific historical conflicts were driven more by resource scarcity, political ambition, or defensive prestige, because motives overlap and evidence is partial. To be clear, this is debated, but you can feel how resources create pressure. When one group controls the warehouse, others negotiate or resent. When one city controls the canal head, others panic. Now you lift that logic into the mythic realm with gentle imagination. What if the cosmic civil war is an exaggerated mirror of resource conflict, a story where the stakes are not barley and copper, but cosmic authority and divine allotments? What if the gods divide responsibilities like a ledger, and one side claims an unfair share? It sounds dramatic, but it is also deeply human, because humans have argued over shares since the first loaf of bread was cut unevenly. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal beings who controlled earthly resources and split into factions, and that myths preserve that split. Again, this isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that myths use cosmic language to discuss social strain, safely giving people a sense that conflicts are part of a larger pattern rather than random cruelty. You pass a group of travellers camped near the gate, wrapped in cloaks. Their animals breathe softly. The travellers speak a different accent, and you realise how connected this world is. Trade brings goods, but it also brings stories. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia was part of broader exchange networks. Archaeology suggests imported materials and cultural interactions. One interpretation is that as stories move, they change, absorbing local concerns and anxieties. Historians still argue whether particular myth motifs originated locally or were influenced by neighbouring cultures, because myths travel in ways that are hard to trace. There's no full consensus, but you can imagine how a tale about divine betrayal could spread fast because it resonates everywhere. People in every era understand broken promises. Now you step into a small administrative room where a clerk is still awake because bureaucracy does not care about bedtime. He sits over a lamp, pressing marks into clay, documenting deliveries and obligations. You watch and feel a strange respect. This is the quiet backbone of the city. Most historians agree that record keeping was essential to temple and palace administration. The evidence we do have points to extensive accounting. One interpretation is that the culture's emphasis on documentation shaped its moral imagination, making truth feel like something written, sealed, and stored. And what if the cosmic civil war is written like a legal dispute, because legal disputes are the most serious conflicts ordinary people know? You imagine a divine courtroom where factions present claims, where one side says the agreement stands and the other says the agreement is obsolete. The council listens. The universe holds its breath. That is gentle imagination clearly framed as possibility. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm. What if imagination? We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Historians still argue whether the divine order in Mesopotamian thought was seen as fixed and eternal, or as something maintained through continual ritual and negotiation, because texts can suggest both stability and vulnerability. To be clear, this is debated, but the very existence of ritual implies maintenance. You do not maintain what cannot break. You step out of the room and into the night again. The stars look sharp, like points pressed into a dark tablet. You think about promises, seals, and the way trust binds a society together. You think about how fragile that binding can be, and you let the cinematic mood settle like a slow exhale. What if, in the stories, the heavens fractured the way human alliances fracture with whispers, accusations bargaining, and the quiet shock of realizing the rules are no longer shared? You walk back toward the river. The water moves steadily indifferent to contracts, yet the city is built on agreements about who maintains which bank and who draws which share. The night feels calm, but underneath it is the awareness that order is always negotiated. And somewhere in that negotiation, the idea of a cosmic civil war becomes less like a battle and more like a warning. Keep your promises, because when promises fail, even the stars can feel unstable. You wake to a hush that feels too complete, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. The air is damp in a way it wasn't last night, and when you step outside, the ground holds a faint shine, as if the city has been brushed with water. You follow the smell first, that wet earth scent that always arrives before you see the reason. Down by the river, the current moves heavier than usual, and people stand along the bank with the tense posture of listeners waiting for bad news. Most historians agree that flooding shaped life in Mesopotamia, sometimes nourishing fields and sometimes destroying homes. Archaeology suggests flood deposits at various sites and settlement patterns influenced by river behaviour. One interpretation is that repeated exposure to floods and environmental uncertainty helped generate powerful stories about disaster and renewal. And what if, when ancient texts describe cosmic upheaval, they are turning the most terrifying natural memory into a mythic stage where chaos and order argue in front of the whole universe? You walk along the bank and see men stacking reeds and mud to strengthen a low wall. Others drag debris out of a canal inlet. A child watches the water with wide eyes, like the river is an animal that might decide to bite. Most historians agree that water management required constant labour and coordination. The evidence we do have points to canals and levees maintained as ongoing community obligations. A careful reading might suggest that flood stories are not just about water, but about the limits of human control. Historians still argue whether specific legendary flood narratives preserve memory of particular historical floods or represent broader symbolic themes of purification and reset, because the archaeological record and the literary tradition do not map neatly. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It means you can respect the emotional truth of the story without pretending you can pin it to a single event. You move into the city and notice the way people talk about the flood. Some describe it as punishment. Some describe it as misfortune. Some describe it as a test. You hear the same range of interpretations you would hear today after any disaster, just with different vocabulary and fewer weather apps. Most historians agree that ancient societies often interpreted natural events through religious frameworks. Archaeology suggests the centrality of ritual in communal life. One interpretation is that myth offers a container for fear, giving people a narrative that makes disaster feel less random. Now, the cosmic civil war mood becomes more about destabilization than combat. What if the war is not a literal clash, but the moment when the cosmos feels like it has lost its balance? When the river rises, you can't negotiate with it. You can only respond. In myth, when chaos rises, the gods respond. Sometimes they argue about how, sometimes they disagree about what should be saved and what should be reset. That is gentle imagination clearly framed as possibility. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature includes themes of disorder, flood, and restoration. One interpretation is that these themes reflect lived environmental vulnerability and social anxiety. A popular rumour claims that catastrophic episodes in ancient myth were actually the aftermath of an Anunnaki conflict, a cosmic civil war that damaged the Earth and forced a reset. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that the flood is a natural disaster elevated into cosmic drama, because that is what humans do with the scariest memories. We turn them into stories that can be told around a lamp so the fear becomes manageable. You walk toward a temple courtyard where priests are preparing a ritual meant to restore balance. They sprinkle water-burn incense and speak words with the measured pace of someone trying to calm a restless world. Most historians agree that ritual played a role in responding to crisis, reinforcing communal order. The evidence we do have points to ceremonies designed to appease deities or ward off misfortune. One interpretation is that ritual is a public statement that chaos will not be allowed to define the community. Historians still argue whether such rituals were primarily psychological comfort, social cohesion mechanisms, or sincere theological negotiation, because those categories overlap. To be clear, this is debated, but you can see the effect. People gather, people focus, people share a common action. That alone changes the atmosphere. You pass a storyteller who has already begun crafting the flood into a tale. He gestures toward the sky and then toward the river, making the audience feel like the two are connected by a single thread. Most historians agree that oral storytelling and written literature interacted with stories retold and reshaped over time. Archaeology suggests literacy was specialized, but narratives were communal. One interpretation is that written myths preserve versions of stories that likely lived in many mouths before they lived in clay. Now imagine softly how a civil war theme could attach itself to a flood theme. In a world where order is maintained through councils' oaths and ritual, a breakdown of that order might be narrated as a breakdown in the heavens. If the divine assembly cannot agree, the world wobbles. If a divine oath is broken, the boundaries weaken. If factions refuse to cooperate, chaos gains room. That is a mood, not a proof. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You walk through a district where people repair walls, sweeping mud from thresholds, patching cracks with fresh plaster. This is the practical side of recovery. Most historians agree that ancient cities face cycles of damage and repair. Archaeology suggests rebuilding episodes at many sites. One interpretation is that the experience of rebuilding reinforces the idea that order is not permanent, it is maintained. Historians still argue whether major urban shifts were driven more by environmental change, political conquest, economic transformation, or internal social stress, because the evidence often points to complex combinations. There's no full consensus, and that complexity is important. It means you should be wary of any single grand explanation, whether it is climate alone or conspiracy alone. Now you encounter a small shrine where someone has placed a simple offering, maybe a bit of bread, maybe a cup of beer. You can tell it was done quietly, without spectacle. This is personal. Most historians agree that religion operated at both public and household levels. Archaeology suggests domestic altars and figurines. One interpretation is that personal devotion offered a sense of control when nature felt uncontrollable. And what if in the cinematic layer this is how cosmic stories function too? Not as propaganda, not as secret code, but as comfort. A story about a cosmic civil war might sound dramatic, but it also implies that chaos has a cause, that it can be understood, that it can be resolved. The alternative is pure randomness, and humans are famously allergic to that. A fringe idea proposes that certain monster figures in myth represent literal creatures or technological constructs left from ancient cosmic conflict. Again, this isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that monsters are metaphors for threats that feel too big to name, plainly floodwaters, disease, famine, war. A careful reading might suggest that when a myth turns a flood into a beast, it is giving the community something to imagine, and therefore something to fight, at least emotionally. Historians still argue whether particular mythic monsters were borrowed motifs, local inventions, or symbolic composites, because the mythic tradition is layered. To be clear, this is debated, but you do not need the monster to be literal to feel its function. It makes fear visible. You head back to the river at dusk. The water has calmed. The sky is streaked with pale colour. People talk softer now, as if the danger has passed, at least for today. You notice how quickly the city returns to routine, because routine is a kind of defiance. Now you let the final what if of this section settle gently. What if the cosmic civil war is a mythic way of describing a universe that sometimes feels internally conflicted, where forces of stability and disruption push against each other? What if the flood is not an accident in the story, but a reminder that chaos is always nearby? And what if the ancient listener, hearing about divine factions and cosmic upheaval, felt the same thing? You might feel now a strange calm in knowing that even the worst storm becomes a story, and stories have endings. You breathe in the river air. You listen to the water. The city behind you repairs itself. The stars above you hold steady. And for tonight, that steadiness is enough. You wake before sunrise, not because you want to, but because the city decides you're part of its schedule. A distant chant drifts through the cool air, low and rhythmic, and you follow it like a sleepy moth following a porch light. The streets are quiet but not empty. People move with purpose, carrying baskets, jars, bundles of reeds, and the occasional look that says, "Please do not ask me anything before I've had my morning beer." Most historians agree that ziggurats and temple complexes were central features of Mesopotamian cities, serving ritual and symbolic roles. Archaeology suggests these structures were monumental projects requiring coordinated labour and resources. One interpretation is that a ziggurat functions as a staged cosmos, an architectural way to connect earth and sky through movement, ascent and ritual. And what if climbing toward a temple summit feels like stepping between factions in a divided heaven? Not because we can confirm it, but because humans love to make height mean importance. You approach the ziggurat as the first light spreads across its tiers. The bricks glow softly, and the long shadows make each step look like a line in a giant ledger. You begin to climb. The air smells of dust and oil lamps, and the city below starts to look smaller, like a model someone built to explain how life works. Most historians agree that monumental architecture often reinforces social hierarchy and communal identity. The evidence we do have points to temples as centres of ritual storage and administration. A careful reading might suggest that the climb itself is part of the message. Order is layered, authority is elevated, and you reach the sacred by following structured steps. Historians still argue whether the primary function of ziggurats was to serve as a platform for a divine shrine, a ritual stage for festivals, or a symbolic mountain representing cosmic order, because the exact usage varied and evidence is incomplete. There's no full consensus, but you can feel the intention even without a footnote. The building is trying to teach your body a lesson. Go up, become humble, become attentive. At a landing you pause and look down. Canals glint in the morning light. Courtyards and streets form a web. Smoke begins to rise from cooking fires. The city looks organised from here, even if it feels messy at street level. One interpretation is that sacred architecture offers a bird's eye sense of coherence that daily life rarely provides. And what if the idea of cosmic conflict enters here because from high places you can imagine larger patterns, larger forces, larger stakes? A popular rumour claims that ziggurats were launch platforms or communication towers built for or by the Anunnaki, tied to a cosmic civil war. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that ziggurats are monumental religious symbols designed to represent a meeting point between human community and divine order. If we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a prompt to ask why people keep reaching for the same imagery. Towers, stairs, heavens, connections. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. What's broadly accepted is that these structures carry deep symbolic meaning for the communities that built them. You continue upward and notice the textures, bricks uneven from hand shaping, mortar lines patched over time, places where repairs were made, because the world does not stop weathering just because you built something sacred. Most historians agree that maintenance and rebuilding were constant in ancient cities. Archaeology suggests layers of construction and renovation. One interpretation is that the need to repair sacred structures mirrors the cultural belief that order requires upkeep both materially and ritually. Historians still argue whether the idea of cosmic order in Mesopotamian thought was conceived as fixed or as something actively maintained through ritual and divine favour, because texts can imply both stability and vulnerability. To be clear, this is debated, but the fact that people keep repairing the same structure suggests a lived truth order is not automatic, it is worked for. At the top, the shrine area is smaller than you expect. That's the funny thing about grandeur. It often leads to a quiet room. A priest lights a lamp. The flame catches steady and warm. Someone places an offering. Someone else murmurs a prayer. The sky above is open, pale blue, and for a moment you feel like the city below has become an ocean of brick and dust, while you stand on an island of ritual. Most historians agree that temple ritual helped reinforce communal identity and cosmic meaning. The evidence we do have points to offerings, hymns, and festival practices. One interpretation is that ritual creates a sense of alignment between human actions and cosmic stability. And what if the stories about divine conflict exist partly to explain why alignment sometimes fails, why the world slips out of tune? You imagine the ziggurat as a mediator, a place where humans can speak upward and hope the answer comes down. Now place the Civil War mood into that image. If the heavens are divided, what does the temple do? It becomes not just a place of worship, but a place of negotiation, a place where you try to keep your city on the right side of the cosmic argument. A fringe idea proposes that temples were built to appease or bargain with literal cosmic rulers. Again, this isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A careful reading might suggest a safer insight. Temples are social and symbolic technologies for dealing with uncertainty because they offer routines when the world feels unstable. You walk along the top platform and hear the sound of wind. It moves across bricks like a slow breath. You look at the horizon and think about how flat the land is. A man-made mountain in a flat land carries extra meaning. Most historians agree that ziggurats were striking visual statements. Archaeology suggests they shaped city skylines and were visible from far away. One interpretation is that visibility itself is part of power. The ziggurat tells everyone our city has order, our God is present, our community is coordinated. Historians still argue whether the primary role of such monuments was religious devotion, political legitimacy, economic coordination, or a blend, because the same structure can serve multiple functions. There's no full consensus, but you can feel how it works on the mind. It makes you think in layers, it makes you accept hierarchy, it makes you imagine the sky as a place with structure. Now the cinematic. What if lands softly? What if the cosmic civil war is a mythic reflection of competing claims to order, and the ziggurat is the city's attempt to anchor itself in the winning version of the cosmos? Not because we can confirm any cosmic conflict, but because the building itself is a vote. It is a commitment to a worldview. It says we believe in order and we will build it in brick if we have to. You start descending and the city grows louder again with each level. The priest behind you continues the ritual steady and quiet. The flame in the lamp keeps burning. That small steady light feels like a promise that someone somewhere is always maintaining the connection. As your feet touch the ground, you realize something simple. In a world where the rivers can flood, and the politics can shift, and the sky can throw storms at your crops, a temple is a way of saying we are still here. We still have a pattern, we still have steps, we still have a place to bring our questions. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And as the morning fully arrives, the ziggurat stands behind you like a quiet ladder, inviting the imagination upward, even while your life stays firmly on earth. You drift into a part of the city that feels unusually quiet for midday, as if everyone agreed to whisper out of respect for something invisible. The reason becomes clear when you see the courtyard, a table laid with small clay tablets, styluses, and a shallow bowl of water that reflects the sky like a tiny portable universe. A few men sit cross-legged nearby, their faces calm, in the way people look when they are doing something that feels important and slightly dangerous, like trying to read the future from math. Most historians agree that Mesopotamians carefully observed the night sky, tracking the motions of the moon and planets, developing omen traditions, and early forms of astral divination in later periods. Archaeology suggests a long tradition of astronomical observation and record keeping, especially in the broader Mesopotamian region over time. One interpretation is that celestial observation offered both practical benefits like calendar regulation and psychological benefits like the comfort of believing the cosmos is readable. And what if the cosmic civil war mood is not written in explosions, but in wandering lights that seem to disagree with the orderly backdrop of stars? You sit down at the edge of the group trying to look like you belong, which is difficult because your posture screams, I am an exhausted modern person with too many tabs open in my brain. One of the observers gestures toward the bowl. The water holds a trembling reflection of the sky, and you realize this is not just about looking up. It's about capturing the sky, shrinking it into a form the human mind can handle. Most historians agree that calendars and timekeeping were vital for agriculture, ritual, and administration. The evidence we do have points to structured month names and lunar cycles used to organize communal life. A careful reading might suggest that once you can predict phases and seasons, you start believing prediction is possible in general. That belief can slide into omens. That belief can slide into stories where the heavens speak. Historians still argue whether astral divination developed primarily from genuine scientific curiosity, political needs for prediction, religious ideology, or a blend, because motives overlap and evolve. There's no full consensus, but you can see how it happens. If your crops depend on timing, and your politics depend on stability, and your life depends on avoiding disaster, you will stare at the sky until it gives you something, even if what it gives you is interpretation. A planet appears at dusk, bright enough to demand attention. You imagine the observers watching it night after night, noticing that it moves differently than the fixed stars. It wanders. It refuses to stay in its lane. Most historians agree that the visible planets were noted and tracked, and that their unusual motion made them symbolically potent. One interpretation is that wandering planets become natural metaphors for disruption within order. And what if in the cinematic, what if layer those wandering lights are treated like banners of competing cosmic forces, as if the sky itself is staging a disagreement? A popular rumour claims that ancient astral knowledge was actually a record of Anunnaki movements, that the planets were their domains, and that the war was mapped in celestial events. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that astronomical observation and myth intertwined because humans naturally link patterns in the sky to patterns in society. If we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still nudges you towards something useful. It reminds you that the sky was not just scenery. It was a text. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. What's broadly accepted is that ancient people read meaning into the heavens, and those meanings influenced ritual and decision making. You watch one observer press marks into clay, recording a date and an observation. The act is oddly soothing. It's like watching someone tidy a room. The universe may be vast, but here it becomes lines and signs you can store. Most historians agree that writing enabled the preservation of observations across generations. The evidence we do have points to record-keeping habits that made cumulative knowledge possible. One interpretation is that the development of written observation creates a new kind of authority, the authority of precedent. If a sign in the sky preceded trouble last time, it might again. Historians still argue whether omen interpretation was primarily superstition, pragmatic risk management, or an early attempt at pattern recognition that mixed accurate observation with symbolic frameworks, because it contains all of those elements. To be clear, this is debated, but regardless of label, the practice tells you something about the human mind. We hate being surprised. Now consider how a cosmic civil war narrative could attach itself to astral thinking. If the heavens are a court, then the planets are like officials, each with a role. If a planet misbehaves, it feels like a faction breaking ranks. If an eclipse interrupts the sun or moon, it feels like someone powerful is being challenged. That is gentle imagination clearly framed as possibility. You sit with the idea that the sky might be used to legitimize earthly authority. A king wants to know whether a campaign will succeed. A priest wants to know whether a festival will be safe. A household wants to know whether sickness will pass. Most historians agree that leadership often sought divine approval or signs. The evidence we do have points to divination practices being integrated into governance in various periods. One interpretation is that astral signs became a language for political and social anxiety. Historians still argue whether rulers used omens primarily as sincere guidance as political theatre, or as both, because the boundary is not clear. There's no full consensus, but you can imagine how a sign from the sky could be used to justify decisions, especially hard ones. If you claim the heavens favour your plan, opposition becomes not just disagreement, but sacrilege. A fringe idea proposes that this is exactly what happened on a cosmic scale, that factions in the sky use signs and portents as weapons in a civil war. Again, this isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that portents are storytelling tools that let humans dramatize uncertainty. When you cannot control the future, you narrate it. You walk at night with the observers to a rooftop. The city below is dark, punctuated by lamps. The sky above is bright with stars, so many that it feels crowded. You see the Milky Way as a pale band, like dust spilled across black cloth. You hear someone murmur a name for a constellation, and you realise these patterns are also a kind of archive. Most historians agree that constellation traditions developed and that star lore was important. Archaeology suggests continuity of sky observation across long periods in Mesopotamia. One interpretation is that naming patterns creates ownership. If you name a group of stars, you can talk about it, teach it, record it. And what if the cosmic civil war story is in part a product of this naming impulse? Once the sky is populated with identities, it can be populated with politics. Historians still argue whether the primary function of astral systems was calendrical divinatory or symbolic, because the same observation can serve multiple purposes. To be clear, this is debated, but you do not need a final answer to feel the atmosphere of it. The rooftop is quiet. The night is huge. The city feels small. You look at a bright planet and imagine it as a messenger, not because you can prove it is, but because stories need messengers. You imagine the divine council watching the same sky from the other side, as if the universe is a mirror facing itself. You imagine factions interpreting the same sign differently, one calling it warning, another calling it opportunity. This is calm what-if imagination. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And now, in the simplest, sleep-friendly way, you understand why the Civil War idea sticks. A war in the sky is a metaphor for a universe that feels alive and contested. The wandering planets make order feel negotiable. The eclipses make stability feel temporary. The omens make the future feel readable, even if it isn't. You climb down from the rooftop and walk through the sleeping streets. A lamp flickers in a doorway. Somewhere someone writes another observation into clay, as if the act of recording is itself a charm against chaos. The stars remain steady. The questions remain open, and you carry them gently like a bowl of reflected sky that might spill if you grip too hard. You wake with that odd feeling that your mind has been quietly sorting the night's ideas into piles like a sleepy librarian who refuses to clock out. One pile is solid ground canals, temples, contracts, rulers, rituals, the sky observed with patient attention. Another pile is mist rumours, theories, modern projections, the itch to turn every ancient metaphor into a headline. You walk through the city as morning light warms the bricks, and you realise the mist pile is not evil. It's just loud. It tends to speak in all caps. Most historians agree that ancient myths are shaped by the societies that tell them, reflecting values, fears and political realities. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian life was grounded in irrigation, agriculture, temple institutions, trade networks and evolving kingship. One interpretation is that myth often dramatizes these realities through divine characters. And what if the same clay that records barley rations also records the human habit of looking up and wondering if someone up there is running the show? Now you arrive at a small courtyard where a few people are gathered around a storyteller who is clearly enjoying himself. He speaks with the confident rhythm of someone who has discovered that a good rumour keeps an audience awake better than coffee. He gestures toward the sky, then toward the temple, then toward a tablet, and he tells a version of the story that leans hard into the extraordinary. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were not just gods, but literal visitors from beyond, and that their internal conflict was a cosmic civil war with consequences on Earth. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is popular in modern retellings because it takes the biggest possible stage and puts dramatic characters on it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can explore it without pretending it is settled fact. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The safest way to handle it is to ask what evidence exists, what it can reasonably support, and where imagination begins. You listen to the storyteller describe shining beings, advanced knowledge, and a war that supposedly echoes through time. It's cinematic, and your brain, being your brain, tries to turn it into a movie trailer. Unfortunately, your brain also remembers it left the laundry in the washer, so the trailer is interrupted by the ancient sound of domestic failure. Most historians agree that the term Anunnaki refers to a group of deities within Mesopotamian religious traditions with meanings and associations that vary across texts and periods. The evidence we do have points to complex pantheons and mythic narratives rather than straightforward historical reporting. One interpretation is that later audiences, including modern ones, sometimes reframe ancient divine language through contemporary concepts like extraterrestrials, technology, and cosmic politics, because we interpret the unknown using the most powerful images we have available. Historians still argue whether specific mythic passages should be read primarily as theological symbolism, political allegory, ritual drama, or layered storytelling that shifts meaning across time, because the same lines can serve multiple functions and the record is incomplete. That debate is your anchor. It keeps you from drifting into certainty when the clay doesn't actually support it. You step away from the storyteller and walk toward a scribal workspace where a few tablets sit drying in the sun. They are ordinary in shape, not magical artifacts humming with secret codes. Most historians agree that the majority of recovered tablets are administrative or economic records, not epic revelations. Archaeology suggests that writing served everyday needs first and foremost. One interpretation is that the extraordinary stories exist alongside the ordinary ones, because people live both kinds of lives, the life of work and the life of meaning. Now you let the fringe detour stay gentle and contained. A fringe idea proposes that certain descriptions of divine travel, brilliant radiance, or heavenly vehicles could be literal technology observed by ancient people. This theory isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient literature uses vivid metaphor, especially when describing divine presence, power, or the sky itself. When you do not have the language of engines and satellites, you reach for the language of storms, fire wings, and chariots. You walk past a workshop where a craftsman polishes a metal object until it catches the sun and flashes bright. The glare is intense enough to make you blink. You think about how easy it is for bright light to feel supernatural, especially in a world where a good lamp is a luxury. Most historians agree that elite objects and ritual settings could create dramatic sensory experiences. Archaeology suggests the use of polished metals, oils, and firelight in sacred contexts. One interpretation is that radiance in myth may reflect ritual aesthetics as much as it reflects cosmology. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind, the kind that people love repeating because it sounds like a clue. Some modern readers point to ancient claims of immense reign lengths or heavenly journeys as hints of something not human. Again, this is debated, and mainstream scholars often interpret such elements as symbolic, time mythic exaggeration, or ideological storytelling. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You pass a temple entrance where a guard stands, and you notice how the presence of a guard changes the feeling of a doorway. A doorway becomes a boundary. Boundaries invite stories about who crosses them and why. One interpretation is that myths about beings descending from the heavens reflect the cultural importance of thresholds, temple gates, city gates, social ranks, the line between chaos and order. And what if the idea of visitors from the sky is less about spacecraft and more about the universal human feeling that power comes from somewhere above your daily reach? Now you take the rumour seriously. In the only safe way, you test it against what is broadly accepted. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion developed over long periods, with shifting emphasis among deities and evolving narrative traditions. Archaeology suggests continuity and change in temples, iconography, and administrative systems. One interpretation is that the richness of the mythic world comes from cultural development, not from a single external intervention. Still, you do not have to mock the fringe idea to keep your footing. You can treat it like a lantern you hold at arm's length. It lights a few interesting questions, even if it doesn't reveal a final answer. For example, why do so many modern retellings insist on turning gods into astronauts? A careful reading might suggest it's because modern people trust technology the way ancient people trusted the divine. If a story contains knowledge, we assume a superior source. If a story contains power, we assume advanced capability. That is a psychological pattern, not proof of anything beyond the human mind. You walk into a small library room where tablets are stored and the air feels cooler, quieter. A scribe runs his finger along a line of impressions and murmurs a translation under his breath. You watch and realize the real mystery is not hidden lasers. It is translation itself. A single sign can have multiple readings depending on context. A phrase can shift tone depending on era and genre. Most historians agree that interpreting ancient texts requires careful philology and context. The evidence we do have points to a complex writing system used across centuries. One interpretation is that modern sensational readings often ignore genre and context, treating myth as literal report. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Sometimes modern readers do careful work and still propose unusual interpretations. But even then, responsible framing matters. If a claim is fringe, label it softly. If evidence is thin, say so gently. So you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You let the storyteller's cosmic civil war remain a cinematic possibility, while you return to what the city shows you plainly. Institutions labour ritual record keeping and a deep human need to place conflict into a meaningful frame. A small joke slips in as you watch a clerk argue with a merchant over the exact count of jars delivered. You think if advanced cosmic beings ran this world, they would still end up arguing about inventory. The universe might be vast, but paperwork is eternal. You step outside as the sun climbs higher. The sky is clean blue, almost too calm for the drama people like to imagine up there. You look at it anyway, because looking is what humans do. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in that quiet space, the fringe theory becomes what it should be for a sleep-friendly channel, a thought experiment, a gentle detour, a way to appreciate how ancient stories and modern minds meet in the same place under the same sky, asking the same question in different words. You wake with a strange respect for how much meaning a single wedge mark can carry. In the morning light, the tablets look almost plain again. Like the mist of the night's theories has evaporated and left you with the simple truth: this is writing pressed into clay by a human hand. Most historians agree that translating ancient Mesopotamian texts requires specialized knowledge of language, context, and genre. The evidence we do have points to signs that can have multiple values and meanings depending on where they appear. One interpretation is that many modern controversies about hidden wars and secret histories begin not in the clay, but in translation choices and the assumptions readers bring with them. And what if the cosmic civil war is less a buried secret and more a shifting shadow created when you hold a lamp too close to a complicated text? You sit in a small scribal room where a translator murmurs to himself, comparing sign lists and reading lines slowly. He doesn't look like someone uncovering a conspiracy. He looks like someone trying to avoid mistakes, which is a very different kind of drama. There are no trumpets. There is only careful attention and the quiet fear of getting a nuance wrong. Most historians agree that ancient texts come in genres: administrative accounts, legal contracts, hymns, myths, laments, royal inscriptions. Archaeology suggests that tablets were produced in institutional settings with specific purposes. A careful reading might suggest that genre matters as much as vocabulary. A myth is not a court record. A hymn is not a battle report. A royal inscription may exaggerate power. That is not a scandal. It is how propaganda works in every era, including yours. where an ad can convince you that a protein bar will fix your emotional life. Historians still argue whether certain disputed passages should be translated in more literal ways or more interpretive ways, because language is slippery and context can be incomplete. There's no full consensus, but you can see the safest approach treat translations as best efforts, not as perfect windows, and stay cautious when someone claims one line definitively proves anything extraordinary. A popular rumour claims that specific Sumerian or Akkadian terms have been mistranslated to hide evidence of a war in the heavens. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that translation is inherently difficult and differences emerge from scholarly debate rather than suppression. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You watch the translator pause over a sign and consider alternatives. He points to parallel uses in other texts to how a word behaves in different contexts. The process is slow and, in a strange way, calming. It reminds you that history is not a sprint to the spiciest conclusion. It is a walk with a lantern, and the lantern only lights a few steps at a time. Most historians agree that many ancient narratives use metaphor and poetic imagery, especially when describing divine actions. The evidence we do have points to rich figurative language storms, as anger floods, as judgment radiance, as holiness mountains, as cosmic centres. One interpretation is that when a myth describes a conflict among gods, it may be exploring cosmic balance and moral order rather than reporting literal events. Historians still argue whether the divine conflicts in these texts should be interpreted primarily as reflections of social and political realities, or as theological explorations independent of politics, because both readings can be valid depending on the text. To be clear, this is debated, but even debate has structure. It is not an anything goes fog. It is careful people disagreeing about meaning. You step outside into the streets and notice a small scene that mirrors the translation problem. Two merchants argue about a word in a contract. One insists it means delivery by the next day. The other insists it means delivery by the next week. A scribe is called to clarify. You realise this is timeless. People have always fought over interpretation, especially when money or barley is involved. And if you ever wanted proof that humans can turn tiny marks into big consequences, congratulations, you are watching it live. Now imagine how a cosmic civil war could be built from translation drift. A phrase about a divine assembly could be read as a council meeting or as a literal gathering of beings. A word for storm could be read as weather or as weaponry in a sensational retelling. A line about the heavens trembling could be poetic awe, or in a fringe interpretation, evidence of cosmic conflict. The difference is not just vocabulary, it is worldview. A fringe idea proposes that the most mainstream translations are wrong, and that a more literal reading reveals hidden accounts of advanced beings and their war. Again, this isn't widely accepted. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and extraordinary claims require careful framing. If we treat it as possibility rather than conclusion, we can notice where the theory gets its fuel ambiguity. Ambiguity is the real treasure and the real trap. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. When a text is damaged, when a sign is unclear, when a genre is uncertain, the space opens for imagination. Some imagination is beautiful and honest. Some imagination pretends to be certainty. We are choosing the beautiful, honest kind. Most historians agree that scribes copied and reworked texts over time, which can introduce variation. Archaeology suggests that tablets can preserve different versions of similar stories. One interpretation is that myths were living traditions, not fixed scripts, meaning they could shift tone and emphasis depending on community needs. And what if the cosmic civil war theme is not one original secret, but a pattern that appears when certain themes align: conflict authority, cosmic order, and the human need to narrate division? Historians still argue whether specific mythic narratives should be dated earlier or later, and how their evolution relates to political history, because dating and transmission are complex. There's no full consensus, but you can see the safe conclusion texts are layered, and layers can create echoes that sound like hidden messages if you listen for them. You return to the scribal room and watch the translator make a note in the margin, a small sign that says uncertain. That word uncertain feels like a moral. It is the correct posture in front of ancient clay. It is also a surprisingly good posture for your life in general, because pretending certainty when you don't have it is exhausting. A popular rumour claims there is a single line, a single tablet, a single smoking gun that reveals the truth about a cosmic war. This isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that the fascination comes from the desire for one definitive answer, but history rarely gives those. It gives patterns. It gives probabilities. It gives debates. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki should be understood primarily as a specific group of deities tied to underworld or divine assembly functions, or as a broader label that shifts meaning across texts because terminology and context vary. To be clear, this is debated, and that debate itself is instructive. It tells you the cosmos in these texts is not a simple map. It is a layered poem. Now you let the cinematic what if settle softly. What if the Civil War is not a literal event to be uncovered, but a metaphorical structure that keeps appearing because humans keep experiencing division? What if ancient scribes encoded the feeling of factions and contested authority into myths about the heavens, not to hide truth, but to express it safely? And what if modern readers, hungry for drama mistake that expression for reportage? We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You step outside as evening approaches. The sky begins to deepen. The city's lamps will soon glow again. And you carry one quiet lesson: sometimes the biggest mysteries are not in the stars, but in the spaces between words. You wake to a day that feels slightly harsher, not in temperature, but in mood, like the city itself has heard too many arguments and wants everyone to speak more politely. The streets are busy early, and you notice something different in the conversations. People are talking about shortages, about a canal that is running low, about a shipment that did not arrive, about a neighbour city that is acting too confident for comfort. Most historians agree that conflict in ancient Mesopotamia often grew from practical pressures, competition over land and water control of trade routes, and legitimacy struggles among rulers. Archaeology suggests cycles of stress and adaptation shaped urban life. One interpretation is that myths relocate these pressures into the heavens, framing human struggle as cosmic drama. And what if the Anunnaki war idea is a calm, mythic way to discuss the ugliest truth of history? Wars often begin with ordinary problems and extraordinary pride. You walk past a canal junction where the water flow has been reduced and men argue over who is taking too much upstream. The argument is not theatrical. It is tight and tired. Most historians agree that water access was a major source of tension in irrigation societies. The evidence we do have points to the necessity of canal maintenance and equitable distribution. A careful reading might suggest that when myths talk about divine allotments, shares or decrees, they echo the everyday reality of allotment and distribution in human life. Historians still argue whether specific historical conflicts were primarily caused by environmental stress, political ambition, or structural pressures in early urban systems, because the record often supports multiple causes at once. There's no full consensus, and that complexity is what keeps you from falling for single cause stories that promise one neat villain. You enter a temple courtyard where officials meet with the king's representatives. Their voices are low but intense. You can feel that this is about more than grain. It is about who gets blamed when grain runs low. Most historians agree that temples and palaces interacted in complex ways, sometimes cooperating and sometimes competing. Archaeology suggests administrative and economic power concentrated in institutions. One interpretation is that legitimacy is always contested when resources tighten, because people demand answers and leaders offer narratives. Now you let the mythic frame come in gently. If a society experiences resource stress, political rivalry, and legitimacy disputes, it may narrate those tensions through divine conflict. A storm god's anger can represent drought anxiety. A divine decree can represent policy. A factional split among gods can represent factional splits among elites. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's a possibility, not a certainty. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki war was literally about resources sometimes described in modern retellings as mining energy or control of Earth itself. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient people understood conflict as a struggle for vital goods, and myths dramatize that struggle in cosmic terms, because cosmic terms feel ultimate. You walk through the market and notice prices whispered between sellers, not shouted. That tells you something. When people whisper prices, they are afraid. Most historians agree that economic stress can destabilize societies. Archaeology suggests shifts in settlement trade patterns and political organization over time. One interpretation is that myths and rituals become more intense during instability because communities seek reassurance that order is still possible. Historians still argue whether major transitions in Mesopotamian history should be understood as abrupt collapses or gradual transformations because archaeology can show both continuity and disruption. To be clear, this is debated, but you feel the human truth when your stomach is worried, your imagination becomes dramatic. You pass a group of young men practicing with weapons in a courtyard. Their movements are more serious than before. An older soldier watches, arms crossed, eyes like stones. Most historians agree that city-states fought and that military readiness could rise during periods of tension. The evidence we do have points to fortifications and warfare in the region. One interpretation is that the presence of armed training in daily life makes war feel like an approaching season, inevitable and cyclical. Now you take the cosmic civil war idea and translate it into safe, grounded terms. What if the myth is not claiming that stars shot at each other, but that the universe itself contains competing forces, order versus disruption, authority versus rebellion, stability versus ambition? In that sense, a civil war in the heavens is a metaphor for a society's internal fracture. It is a way to say we are not united, and that is dangerous. Historians still argue whether myths of divine conflict were used to justify conquest, explain suffering, or teach moral lessons about obedience and harmony, because texts can function differently depending on who uses them. There's no full consensus, but you can see the narrative usefulness. If you tell people that a cosmic conflict is playing out, you can make them feel their sacrifices are part of something meaningful. A fringe idea proposes that this is not metaphor at all, that the gods were literal beings and their conflict left material traces. Again, this isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A careful reading might suggest the more stable insight is that myths can shape how people interpret events. If a city loses a battle, people may say the god withdrew favour. If a king rises, they may say the god chose him. This is not necessarily deception, it is worldview. You walk toward the palace and see banners and guards, symbols of authority meant to be seen. Most historians agree that rulers used display ritual and inscription to project legitimacy. Archaeology suggests monumental works and public messaging tied to kingship. One interpretation is that legitimacy requires performance, especially in crisis. And what if the cosmic civil war theme functions as an ultimate legitimacy story? Our faction aligns with the rightful cosmic order, the other faction does not. Historians still argue whether rulers genuinely believed their propaganda or strategically deployed it, because sincerity and strategy can coexist. To be clear, this is debated, but the effect is the same. People follow, people fear, people hope. You pass a shrine where someone has placed a small offering, perhaps asking for protection. You realise protection is not just about physical safety, but about moral safety. The desire to believe the universe will not betray you. Most historians agree that personal devotion coexisted with institutional religion. Archaeology suggests household religious practices. One interpretation is that in times of tension, people seek personal connection to the divine, because institutions feel too large to comfort them directly. Now the cinematic what if settles into a more human scale. What if the cosmic civil war is not a spectacle, but a mirror held up to society? What if the factions are not aliens, but archetypes? The strict ruler, the clever mediator, the ambitious challenger, the anxious community. What if the war is not in space, but in the heart of a city, deciding whether to cooperate or fracture? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths blend theology, social reflection, and cultural memory. One interpretation is that divine conflict can reflect human conflict. And what if the story is pointing at something else, not a hidden truth of extraterrestrial warfare, but the timeless truth that when resources tighten and pride rises, people tell themselves stories to survive the fear. Historians still argue whether environmental shifts like droughts or river changes played a central role in certain upheavals, because the evidence can be suggestive but not always conclusive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And that mystery can be held gently without turning it into panic. As evening falls, the city's sounds take on a sharper edge. Conversations become quieter. Doors close earlier. Lamps burn longer. You walk along the canal and watch the water move steady but reduced, and you understand why water becomes sacred and political at the same time. In your mind, the heavens are not a battlefield of explosions. They are a council struggling to agree. They are a ledger being contested. They are a story trying to explain why peace is fragile. And in that calm, sleep-friendly frame, you can hold the idea of a cosmic civil war as a metaphor with power without claiming it as a confirmed event. You breathe out. The night arrives. The city waits tense but still alive. You wake to a morning that feels almost gentle, as if the city has decided to stop shouting and start thinking. The light is pale, the air is cooler, and the usual clatter of carts and voices sounds softer, like everyone is trying not to disturb something fragile. You walk toward a quiet corner near a temple wall where a scribe has set up his tools. He is older, his hands steady, his face unhurried. He presses signs into clay with the calm patience of someone who understands that the world is made of small actions repeated. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion and social identity were tightly intertwined with city life, organized around temples, rituals, and shared cosmology. Archaeology suggests that deities were connected to specific cities, and that cult practice shaped community. One interpretation is that myths about divine conflict offer a framework for understanding human conflict, giving chaos a narrative shape. And what if the cosmic civil war idea is simply the most spacious metaphor available, a way for ancient minds to place social fracture into the sky so it can be stared at safely? You sit nearby, listening to the stylus tap and press. The sound is rhythmic, almost like rain on a window. You realise that this is the true heartbeat of the story. not a battle scene, not a revelation, just someone recording, preserving, organising, trying to hold order in a world that changes. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of many mythic texts was ritual performance, education, political legitimization, or personal devotion, because texts can serve different needs and evolve over time. There's no full consensus, but you can feel how stories function here. They are not only entertainment, they are tools for living. A careful reading might suggest that when a myth depicts gods arguing, dividing responsibilities, and issuing decrees, it reflects a culture deeply familiar within institutions, contracts, and councils. The evidence we do have points to administrative complexity and social hierarchies that shape daily life. One interpretation is that cosmic order is modelled on civic order. That is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's a possibility, not a certainty. You stand and walk through the city one last time in your mind, letting everything you have seen settle into a single coherent shape. Canals because water is life, temples because meaning is survival, contracts because trust holds the community together, kingship because leadership is contested, ritual because order must be maintained, the sky because it is the biggest screen on which humans can project their questions. A popular rumour claims that all of this is literal evidence of advanced beings and a cosmic civil war that unfolded above and among early civilizations. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that the Anunnaki in mainstream scholarship are divine figures within Mesopotamian religion, and that mythic conflict is a literary and theological way of exploring order and disruption. If we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a thought experiment. How would the story feel if it were literal? And what does that reveal about why we want it to be literal? Historians still argue whether modern fascination with ancient astronaut ideas reflects genuine unresolved questions in the evidence, or primarily reflects modern cultural imagination, because both can be present in different proportions. To be clear, this is debated, but you can see how the safest path is also the most honest. Keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths were composed, copied, and reshaped over long periods, interacting with political shifts, ecological pressures, and changing religious emphases. Archaeology suggests continuous human activity, institutional development, and cultural exchange. One interpretation is that divine rivalries can map onto city rivalries and institutional tensions, and that cosmic civil war language is an elevated mirror of real fractures. This raises the possibility that the myths preserve emotional truth about instability, even when they are not literal history. Now you let the cinematic what if remain gentle and clearly framed. What if, in a symbolic sense, there really is a civil war in the universe, not in the form of spaceships, but as a constant tension between forces that organise and forces that disrupt? What if the ancient writers sensed that tension in everything rivers, that both nourish and flood leaders who both protect and exploit rituals that both comfort and control? What if the gods arguing in the sky are the culture's way of saying we live inside competing pressures and we need stories to help us keep breathing? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the honest beauty of this topic is that it lets you hold two truths at once. History is grounded in mud brick and barley, and imagination is grounded in the stars. You return to the scribe by the temple wall. He finishes a line, pauses and smooths the clay. His motion is slow and deliberate. You wonder what he thinks he is doing. He might say he is honouring the gods. He might say he is preserving a story. He might say he is doing his job. All of those can be true at the same time. Historians still argue whether the divine in Mesopotamian thought was primarily seen as personal and relational, or as institutional and cosmic. Because texts can portray both intimacy and grandeur, there's no full consensus. But your walk through the city suggests a balanced view. People pray for daily needs. Institutions invoke gods for legitimacy. Myths explore cosmic order. All of it is part of one human attempt to live with uncertainty. Now the final question lands softly. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden war you must expose, but a pattern you can recognize. When societies are stressed, stories become bigger. When legitimacy is contested, the heavens become contested. When resources tighten, gods argue. When rules feel fragile, cosmic order becomes a topic. This is a careful reading, not a certainty, but it helps you understand why the Civil War motif feels so natural. A fringe idea proposes that the motif is evidence of literal cosmic politics. Again, this isn't widely accepted. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The safer and more durable insight for long-term growth is that the myths are meaningful regardless of literalness, because they reveal how humans relate to power, nature, and uncertainty. And now as the sun lowers, the city's sounds soften. You feel the pace slowing, the edges rounding. Your breathing deepens without you trying. The lamplight begins to matter more than the daylight. The world becomes smaller and kinder. Most historians agree that ancient people lived close to darkness, relying on lamps and firelight at night. Archaeology suggests the presence of household lamps and communal ritual lighting. One interpretation is that night invites story, because when you cannot see far, you imagine far. And what if the cosmic civil war story is a night story, in the deepest sense, a way of giving shape to the unseen, so it does not feel like it will swallow you? Historians still argue whether specific myths were told primarily in elite contexts, or widely shared through oral tradition, because literacy was specialized but storytelling was communal. To be clear, this is debated, but you can imagine a family gathered in a courtyard, listening to a tale of gods and councils and oaths, not to learn a secret, but to feel that chaos has a name and order has a chance. Now we begin the wind down, slow and soft, letting the day's heat fade from the bricks, and letting the mind loosen its grip on needing answers. You walk one last time along the river, and the water moves with that steady patience that makes you feel small in a comforting way. The surface reflects the first stars, and you think about how many nights those stars have watched people ask the same question in different languages. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian people observed the sky with care, tying it to calendars and meaning. One interpretation is that the stars became a kind of reassurance, because even when politics shifted and floods came and rulers changed, the sky stayed recognizable. And what if for the ancient listener, the idea of a cosmic civil war was not meant to frighten but to explain? If order can be threatened, it can also be restored. If the gods can disagree, they can also come to terms. If factions can split, they can also reunite. The story becomes a lullaby, shaped like a debate, reminding you that conflict is part of the world, but so is repair. You notice the sound of water against the bank, a soft, repetitive hush. It is the same kind of sound as a stylus pressing into clay, the same kind of sound as a lamp flame, breathing the same kind of sound as your own exhale. Your shoulders drop, your eyes feel heavier, your thoughts slow, not because they are solved, but because they are safe to leave unfinished. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And in that separation you can relax, because you are not required to choose one extreme. You can enjoy the mainstream history, the real cities and canals and temples, and you can also enjoy the quiet. What if the cinematic possibility that the heavens reflect our own struggles for order? The stars above you do not demand belief. They only shine. The river does not demand conclusions. It only flows. The city behind you does not demand certainty. It only lives. You let the night air cool your face. You let the questions drift farther away like boats untied from the shore. You let the cosmic arguments become distant like thunder, heard from far across the plain, too far to matter, just close enough to feel like the world is large. And as you turn back toward a quiet room and a low lamp and a place to rest, you allow yourself to hold the simplest ending of all. The past is real, the stories are powerful, and the mystery is gentle.